Welcome to the second episode on data breaches. And to have this conversation, I have with me my special guest, Thanuki. And in the previous episode, she took time to explain in legal terms what is a data breach or when an incident becomes a data breach. Thanuki, welcome back again. And I would like you to walk us through various types of data loss incidents, or what actually causes these incidents and what would be the end result. So if you could just take some time to tell our audience the different types of data loss incidents would be great. Over to you.
All right. So there are different categories of data breaches. You can say that each category has very distinct flavors to the way it comes about. But in practice, why it is important for us to know each of these categories a little bit because lines get blurred and there can be a bit of ambiguity and complicate the response and reporting aspects of each of these categories.
Absolutely.
So, how I'm going to do this is I'm going to talk to you about a few of the categories of data breaches, and I'm going to also give you an example or two, so that you can do some reading by yourself at home and get to know more about it. Because some of these incidents, these cases, are real eye openers and offer great learning points for in a cybersecurity and also a data protection perspective, as well as a legal one. So if you take the first category we can focus on is accidental exposure. So that is something I feel like people think that because it is an instance where maybe sensitive data is unintentionally made accessible due to some sort of human error or let's say a misconfiguration or some form of oversight without malicious intent. Because when we talk about data breaches, I think people always think of like bad person, a hacker. You think of like ransomware. You think of like the things where there is a malicious intent. But a data breach doesn't always have to be based on malice, is something we need to remember. So this is a good example of that. And it's often things like this are a result of poor processes and also sometimes lack of training rather than an attack. So there is no deliberate intent usually. It's often a mistake. And sometimes common causes can be things like it can be misconfigured cloud storage. It can be a situation where emails are sent to a wrong person and then it triggers something, or even lost devices being found somewhere and then people gaining access to that. And then it leads on to something else. So sometimes the impact is harmless, but sometimes it can be catastrophic as well if the data is discovered by bad actors. So that is what we need to essentially be worried about. So a real world example of this is in 2019, there was, so Capital One had a misconfiguration situation where a former Amazon AWS employee had exploited a misconfigured firewall in Capital One's AWS environments, it's Amazon Web Services environment, and had exposed a little over 100 million customers' data, which included credit scores and pretty important information. So initially, this was categorized as an accidental exposure, but Capital One's misconfiguration had left that data vulnerable, and eventually along the way, it became a breach when it became exploited. So the ambiguity here, I would say, lies in the timing, because it wasn't a breach the moment the firewall was misconfigured. That is where there's accidental exposure, but rather it was when it was caused to be exploited. So the point right after that. So you can see how something that starts off accidental can very quickly turn into something that you lose control over. And that's why this conversation with data breaches today is very important. And you need to understand the differences in the way these can get triggered as well. There was also another incident was with Verizon. They also had a similar incident. It was a misconfiguration on similarly another AWS S3 bucket situation. So no evidence of malicious access surfaced at the time. Technically, it was accidental exposure. Data was public but not necessarily accessed. Legally, under US state laws, notification wasn't required without proof of harm. But the company treated it as a breach to err on the safe side. The ambiguity is there was no confirmed access, yet public exposure felt like a breach. Okay, so that's a kind of a different take on that. Each of these cases are very interesting because, like I said
Absolutely.
before, they have very distinct flavors to the way they present themselves. Yes, Sujit?
What I was trying to highlight here is in Verazine's case, what you mentioned is they took that extreme step to say,
Yeah,
not waiting to prove that there's, proof of somebody accessing it, but they declared. So they notified the customers and said, okay, we got a situation at hand.
yeah. That would
It's very interesting to see how people handle each of these situations.
for sure.
Go ahead.
So the next one would be insider threats. So if you take insider threats, these are where breaches are caused by individuals who are within an organization or closely associated within to an organization. So, for example, like contractors, if they're associated, or they can be their employees or partners who misuse their access either maliciously or negligently. Now, this is so there are two different ways of looking at intention there. One is negligence and one is malice. So it is hard to detect because insiders have legitimate access, and that is where the problem arises. And it'll often involve sensitive data due to the insider's roles. A good example of this was, I think, if you can remember, the 2013 Edward Snowden incident. This was like a standard, like a textbook example that we've been taught, over the years of the NSA leak. He was a contractor. He deliberately exfiltrated classified documents exposing US surveillance programs, and this is a clear insider threat. It was malicious, it was calculated, and it was impactful. There was no
There was a
ambiguity.
motive as
There was
well.
a motive, right? So there is no ambiguity when it comes to that example.
Absolutely.
Um, another situation is, I mean, up until recently, we've been seeing this. Various Apple engineers from time to time have been charged with data theft for stealing driverless car secrets for a China based company. Even, I think, somewhere around Jan this year, a guy was basically taken in for stealing thousands of
Correct.
files containing proprietary information, while secretly he was working for an unnamed Chinese company. Um, and he was, I think there was 6 counts of theft or attempted theft of trade secrets in that indictment. And this is, I think, the third or fourth time an ex-Apple employee has been accused of stealing autonomous tech secrets for China. And this is also very interesting because given the geopolitical situation at the moment, um, when it comes to tech and all of that between US and China. So we're seeing this, right?
Absolutely.
These are things that are close to the hearts of the people of these nations, and it weaves in quite well to this discussion today as well.
So,
And very quickly on to a third time, we can look at external attacks. So previously we were looking at insider threats. Now we're looking at breaches by outside actors. So those can be hackers, it can be cyber criminals, or it can be state-sponsored groups using techniques like malware or exploiting vulnerabilities to gain unauthorized access of some sort. So remember, these kind of things are deliberate, they're malicious, they're often quite sophisticated, and well thought of. So, ransomware, SQL injection, credential stuffing, these kind of things take quite a bit of knowledge and planning when it comes to external attacks. A good example of this was the Equifax breach in 2017,
yes.
which there they exploited an unpatched Apache Struts vulnerability, which stole about 148 million people's data. It was classified as an external attack. The hackers were outsiders, but Equifax's failure to patch a known vulnerability for months raised quite a few questions at the time. So there was questions as to whether this was accidental exposure due to negligence, or um, but rather they saw it legally as an external breach because the hackers stole the data. But technically, Equifax's oversight is what enabled it, making it feel like a hybrid situation. So you can,
So,
I mean, there's a classification there of a hybrid between an external attack and what we discussed at the very beginning as well.
so
Um,
what you are saying here is inaction leads to a hybrid situation.
can very much lead to a hybrid situation.
Yeah,
It
because
was
when the IT management is aware that they need to do something
yeah,
and not attending or treating that exposure is leading to a breach because you're actually enabling a threat actor to exploit that weakness. That's what you're trying to say here.
correct, correct.
Right. Gotcha.
Um, so the public and the regulatory focus at that point was split between blaming the hackers and also Equifax's lapses, which
Hmm.
kind of made a mess of the narrative at the time. But you can see now how, I mean, the insight from that, I would think, is that sometimes these data breaches may not take on a singular kind of face or characteristic. It may be a hybrid as well, which is also very interesting, I would think.
Correct.
Um, and maybe if we get into one more, which is third
So
party vendors,
go
this
ahead.
is where your breaches are originating from external parties, vendors, or service providers who handle an organization's data and fail to secure it. And in this situation, the primary organization often isn't directly at fault per se, but will be responsible when it comes to vendor oversight. So there's no point in you being like, we've given the job to somebody and then wash your hands off of the matter thereon, right? Your responsibility extends even to things like that, especially when it comes to people's data.
Absolutely.
Um, and it often involves supply chain attacks, vendor vulnerabilities, and can amplify due to vendors serving multiple clients. So this is how this comes about. A good real world example of this, there are two. I will just, in the interest of time, focus on one, which is the 2013 Target breach, where hackers had accessed Target's network via stolen credentials from a third-party HVAC vendor who stole 40 million credit card numbers.
Yeah.
There are a few questions. Is this a third party vendor issue or is it an external attack? The vendor's weak security was the entry point, suggesting that it was a vendor issue, but the hacker's deliberate exploitation felt like an external attack. So, Target was held accountable, but the classification of what this incident essentially is uh, was a little blurry, okay, as to whether it was Target or whether it was a vendor who was primarily at fault. Either way, I would think it was right to consider that both parties had a hand to play in this, in which
Absolutely.
way ultimately, because protecting data has to be at the core of any organization that works with data of individuals. But now you cannot say that that's not happening because data is everything, data is everywhere.
Absolutely. And also, I think at the end of the day, the data owner
Yes,
ultimately becomes responsible for anything happening to that data, isn't it?
yes,
Because the HVAC vendor probably may not have been accessing the data to provide services because they were
yes,
only providing probably the peripheral services. But at the end of the day, a breach there was, translated into a breach of exfiltrating the data.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And I just think that what even from a legal or a compliance perspective, something that people need to remember is that these different kinds of breaches rarely fit neatly into one box, and it's important that you keep that in mind when it comes to handling incidents or even looking at mitigating them or preventing them even, or even when it comes to the post incident situation. You need to understand that it's often not going to be a clear cut thing, and you will have to think beyond what you usually do.
absolutely. Thanuki, thank you so much. And I think you brought in good perspective to a breach conversation. Because typically when people talk about a breach, they only say, hey, there's a breach. But the way you brought in these examples, like accidental exposure to insider threats, to external attacks, and the third party vendor issues, all of them Sometimes you could have all 4 or 5 of them in one specific issue as well. And actually, it's a good recipe for a hybrid situation and a good case study. And viewers, I mean, I would encourage all of you to, we would also post the links for some of these use cases where you can actually go and do in-depth reading. And it'd be a good, interesting read for you to also understand how the breach occurred and how you could learn from these so that you could avoid a situation. Right. So I request all of you to stay tuned to our next episode where we're going to be talking about the third-party data exposures and how it will impact the organization. So Thanuki, thank you so much again, and I look forward to seeing you on the other side for the third episode. Thank you.